Hey there! If you love exploring Christian philosophy and theology, you're in the right place. The video's about to get started, but first, I want to ask you a question. Do you find the content I produce on this channel valuable? If so, here are some ways you can help promote it. The first is completely free. Give this video a like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Second, consider doing a one-time donation, kind of like a tip. You can do this in the form of a super chat or super thanks below. Third, consider becoming a patron. Patrons get early access to videos, they get to be a part of a patron-only Facebook group we call TAC Academy, and patrons can participate in the book club that meets on Zoom once a month. The link to become a patron is in the description. Thanks to all my current patrons for your support. Enjoy the interview. Did the historical Jesus think that he was divine? That's the question we'll be exploring, and I'm joined by Dr. Craig Evans, a distinguished professor of Christian origins at Houston Christian University. Thank you very much, Dr. Evans, for joining me.
Oh, you're very welcome. Good to be with you.
So I was reading through a book called Oxford Readings in Philosophical Theology, the first volume, and Dr. Evans has an essay in that book called Jesus' Self-Designation, the Son of Man, and the Recognition of His Divinity. And I thought it would be good to bring him on and discuss it. And he actually let me know that he's authored a new essay on the Christology of Jesus. And so we're going to pair those two papers up in this interview and explore some of the main points. So first, let me ask you this, Dr. Evans. Can you unpack some of that evidence that you mentioned in that first paper regarding Jesus' self-understanding and explain, what he thought about himself?
I think the place to begin is Jesus's frequent self-reference as the Son of Man. And I'm disappointed with New Testament scholarship for the last 100 years because it's made it more complicated than it ever needed to be. And for a couple of reasons. One of them is the bias in the modern era against eschatology. So save Jesus from himself. So we don't want him to be identified with the apocalyptic, Son of Man of Daniel. That was the main problem. Now, CFD Moule, back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, he had it right on the money. He said the definite article means a specific character called Son of Man, and that's Daniel 7. And his student, Bruce Chilton, maintained the same view, and I think they're both correct. And others, and actually my sense is more and more scholars are coming around to that point of view. All of this baggage with Son of Man, some kind of Gnostic savior or primordial, whatever. A lot of that is disappearing now. So it's a recognition that the person in the vision of Daniel 7 receives from God authority. And he's described as one like a Son of Man. He's human in appearance. And I'm right in the middle of right now. In fact, before we began this conversation, I'm working on a revision of my Mark commentary. And I'm looking at chapter 2, where Jesus says, that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. What's this on earth? It's in contrast to in heaven. In heaven, he receives the authority. On earth, he now exercises it. Well, another development is that the Son of Man in the similitudes is now dated to the late 1st century BC instead of into the 1st century or 2nd century AD, and therefore irrelevant or something like that. So when Jesus refers to himself as the Son of Man, there's a little bit of freight, there's a little bit of baggage already there. And so he's not at random picking out something. He knows what he's doing. He's referring to a specific figure who in heaven from God receives authority. When you continue to look at other things like the similitudes of Enoch, and some of our listeners might not know what that means, the book of Enoch, chapters 37 to 71, that now it's almost a consensus. It predates Jesus by just a couple of decades. predates his ministry perhaps by half a century. And so what we have is a very exalted figure. And this is why Dale Allison, you might recall, Constructing Jesus 2010. And no one would accuse Dale of being a simple, apologist and fundamentalist, blah, blah, blah. He's a distinguished professor nearing retirement at Princeton. And he says, and I'm quoting the last sentence, I think it is, of his chapter in Constructing Jesus, the chapter on Jesus' self-understanding, where he says, we ought to hold a funeral for the view that Jesus held no exalted self-understanding. So I'm answering your question in a roundabout way. So the answer is yes, Jesus had an exalted self-understanding. It's centered, it was expressed by his Son of Man discussion. Son of Man, of course, is not really a title. It's not a technical term, and that's why you don't have Son of Man confessional talk in the New Testament. The only thing that comes close is Stephen before his martyrdom in Acts, the book of Acts. Otherwise, everything in the New Testament is Jesus is the Son of God. He's the Messiah or Christ. He is the Savior. He's the Redeemer. Son of Man was Jesus's way of talking about identifying himself with a certain figure in Scripture. That is extraordinarily exalted. Right here in front of me, the Bulletin for Biblical Research, a few years back, Marcus Zender, a German evangelical scholar, he says there's no question the figure in Daniel 7 is a divine figure. The other thing perhaps you don't know, but every Greek manuscript that we know of in the biblical period, in the New Testament period of time, understood in Daniel 7, the Ancient of Days is himself the human being, the one like a Son of Man. I don't think that's what Daniel originally said. This is not a Christian reinterpretation, it's plausibly suggested. It's a pushback against the idea of two divine powers. The rabbis were troubled by that. And so it's likely a Jewish interpreter, as the Greek is translated, said, why don't we just talk about one heavenly personage that's divine? And I think that's very plausible and likely correct. But the point is, if the Son of Man is seen as God, one and the same with God, at about the same time the similitudes of Enoch are coming together, where the Son of Man sits on the glorious throne, and don't forget it's God who sits on the glorious throne of David, according to the chronicler. These things are coming together, and Jesus, therefore, using Son of Man, the Son of Man who has authority to pronounce Sabbath law, who can forgive sin, but only God can do that, the scribes correctly say. That's right. So I think there is a very high Christology, though it is largely implicit in the New Testament. And it comes to, and I'll stop because I know you're going to have questions for me, but it comes to a head when Caiaphas the high priest says, tell us plainly, are you the Messiah, the Son of God? He says the Son of the Blessed, of course, and uses a euphemism, a circumlocution. And Jesus says, I am, and ego eimi just means yes. You'll see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power, another circumlocution for God, coming with the clouds of heaven. So Daniel 7 is merged then with the Davidic Psalm. And so he is the Davidic Messiah. That's the Son of Man figure in Daniel 7. That's a very exalted Christology. He will sit on God's throne next to God the Father. So that's pretty exalted. It can't get any more exalted than that. And so I think the answer to your big question at the beginning of the program is yes, I think he does see himself as sharing in the divine Godhead. Now, theologians are going to have to parse that, and they do. They come up with the Trinitarian confession and articulation. But as far as Jesus is concerned and his first followers, it's a blow away moment. That's why we talk about incarnation. God makes himself present and known in the person of Jesus of Nazareth. I'll stop and you can nuance this with more questions.
Yeah. Okay, that was really interesting. There was a few things you said that I was unaware of. One thing that I wanted to ask about is, even if someone concedes that the Son of Man that's referred to is that Daniel 7 figure, and that Daniel 7 figure is extremely highly exalted. This figure seems to share a throne with God. I know the text in Daniel says, some translations say serve, or others say worship, but from what I can tell, the way that that word served functions is as worship. Am I understanding that? Like, when I look at in the rest of Daniel, when that word served is used, it's always in like a term of worship, used as a term for worship.
Now, are you referring to Daniel in the Greek or Daniel in the Aramaic?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah.
I guess I'm thinking, well, I don't know. You probably know better than me. I'm probably thinking of the Greek. Yeah, I bet you I'm thinking of the Greek, because I think the software that I use is talking about the
Okay.
Septuagint.
Yeah, and probably if we were talking about both languages, we probably have both ideas. But Jesus clearly alludes to Daniel 7:13 and 14 in his famous statement that the Son of Man has come not to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom for many. And of course, the concept parallels, the conceptual parallel is clear. 7:13, 14 is the backdrop to that. But verbally, he's not following the Greek. So your point probably fits there. And again, I'm kind of fresh on this subject because of recent reading and writing. And so I completely agree with Hengel and some of these others that what's going on is the suffering servant is lending scriptural warrant for what really is a subversion of Daniel. And the early church doesn't do that. The church quotes scriptures, they proof text, they look for scriptures that support confessional positions and statements and explain things. Jesus is the one that takes the freedom to say, I don't care what Daniel 7:14 says, which says the nations will serve him when he receives the kingdom. No, he says, I didn't come to be served, but to serve. And that's a subversion. Now, of course, if you were to question him, say, well, what eventually will happen? Say, oh, yeah, they will serve me. But initially, he does the serving. You see subversion elsewhere, where Daniel thanks in Daniel chapter 2, thanks God for revealing these things to the wise. And of course, it's the explanation of Nebuchadnezzar's strange dream about the image. And Jesus then thanks, and this is in Q tradition, it's not in Mark, but in Q tradition, he thanks God that he didn't reveal these things to the wise, but to babes. So this is Jesus, he'll take scriptures and combine them. And that's almost always, if there's a subversion going on, it's because there's another text. And so he's being a little bit like the proto-rabbis in conflating and pulling together texts. And then you end up with a third idea that you won't find in either text singly or individually. Mm-hmm. So Jesus is deep into this figure, and he has the authority, therefore, to say things that an ordinary prophet can't say or can't do. And making, we may think, pronouncing about what you can or can't do on the Sabbath, or saying you're the Lord of the Sabbath, that might not make a lot of sense to us moderns, but in the Jewish mind, that's a huge statement, because even God respects the Sabbath in the Jewish mind. And Jesus saying that the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath, which is a remarkable statement also.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I didn't quite complete my thought. I got on a rabbit trail about the word serve and worship. But before I complete the thought, let me say one more thing about that Daniel 7 passage. So not only is thrones spoken of in the plural, so there's more than one here, and this figure is given the Son of Man figure is given authority, shares a throne, seems extremely exalted. In addition to that, he's riding the clouds. From what I can tell, riding the clouds has some significance, like that's what God does. Is
Yes.
that correct?
Yes, you're right.
Okay. Okay. So it seems like this Son of Man figure is extremely exalted. Now I want to complete my thought. Even if someone says, yes, the texts that we're thinking of where Jesus is saying, um, the Son of Man came not to serve, not to be served, but to serve, and so on. These texts, yeah, they're referring to this Daniel figure when he's at his trial and he speaks of the Son of Man. Yeah, he's referring to that Daniel figure. But what if somebody, I'm thinking here of Bart Ehrman, says, but Jesus wasn't talking about himself. He wasn't identifying himself as the Son of Man. These verses he seems to be speaking about someone else. What do you say in response to that kind of move?
Well, he's very out of date if that's the argument he's going to make. I know Bultmann and a few others back in the day were making that kind of argument. Book right on top of my head in the shelf behind me, there's Bultmann, and that's what he says then. That's largely abandoned now. So that's not much of an argument. He's not talking about somebody else. He clearly is talking in reference third personing himself. By the way, the practice of third personing is its own subject that is highly suggestive of an exalted self-understanding. Casey, or not Casey, what's person's first name? Robin Elledge makes a point of that also. So that's yet one more clue. Some of these objections from Bart Ehrman or others are actually they're decades out of date. There's stuff that he was hearing when he was a PhD student back in the 80s at Princeton, but that's just not the thing anymore. So I think you need to deal a little more with current scholarship on the subject. What I find refreshing is a willingness to leave behind some of the dubious theories. Some of them grew out of the history of religion school, and just a tendency to say, look, we're going to explain it as an evolution of ideas and no innovation and that kind of thing. And so it's both. There's an evolution of ideas. Traditions are picked up. The Jewish faith is highly traditional. And so the tradition is sacred. How can you view it otherwise? But Jesus is the one who's so innovative. And the church is less innovative. The church gets far too much credit as inventing tradition all the time. And the Jesus Seminar was sort of the last gasp of that old-fashioned German form critical way of thinking. And it's discredited now, and the discussion has moved on.
Okay, so that first piece of evidence, if I could summarize the argument, hopefully I'm characterizing it correctly, it would go something like this. Jesus identifies himself as the Son of Man from Daniel 7, and the Son of Man from Daniel 7 was thought of, at least in the time of Jesus, as an extremely exalted figure, you might say divine. So then Jesus, by identifying himself as that figure, is identifying himself as divine. Would that be a fair characterization?
You've summed it up well. And thanks for making that point that I think it's great that Daniel commentators, and I'm a good friend of John Collins and respect his work. In fact, right in front of me is his commentary in Hermeneia on Daniel. And he thinks that it's possible when the book of Daniel received its final shape in 2nd century BC that the human figure is an angel. Maybe it's Michael, and that's quite possible. I do have some doubts about that, and in fact, I'll share them right now. You touched on it a moment ago about the clouds, and in the Aramaic, the one like a son of man. It doesn't actually say a son of man. You realize that it's like a son of man, so it's a figure in contrast to the beasts that have been described earlier in the chapter and elsewhere. That this is a human form. It's some things, whatever this critter is, looks like a human, and he comes with the clouds. And the Aramaic, it's the same as the Hebrew here. The preposition is im, but in the Greek, instead of mata, as you would expect, meaning with, mata with the genitive case, it's epi, upon the clouds. And boy, and then that's interesting. And I think that goes along with the identification of the human with the Ancient of Days. It's God who rides on the clouds. And, you get that same, you get the same thing in the old Canaanite myth. And of course, the Daniel image we think is modeled after it to some extent. So the Ancient of Days is like El, and Baal comes to him riding on the clouds and is presented to him. It's very, very modeled after that. And by the way, Baal is a god also. So it's a big god, little god, and they get together, and the big god confers authority on the junior god to carry out whatever his mission is. So I think riding on the clouds, and there's some very suggestive 4 or 5 scriptures about God on the cloud, coming on the cloud. The cloud is his chariot. So I think there's been an enhancement on that level too. So a switch in preposition, a switch, heos, up to, unto becomes hos, as, and then the attendants are now attending the Son of Man the way, it's like a parallelism, the way they were attending the Ancient of Days. So this text has been upgraded, and the cloud part is part of it. And the idea of judgment, the Son of Man will judge. What? That's what he does in Enoch. He sits on the glorious throne. Well, wait a minute. This is in heaven. Who's sitting on the throne? It's supposed to be God. And so you see how it coheres. It's not to say that the Son of Man figure in the similitudes is exact with Jesus's teaching. I don't mean to say that. But what it attests is a very exalted understanding of this Daniel 7 figure who sits on God's throne and judges the nations. And the kings are brought before him and bow before him. According to the Old Testament, they bow before Yahweh. And then you realize, oh, wait a minute. Who uses Yahweh texts? Paul does in indisputably authentic Pauline letters like Philippians. So Paul is not upgrading Christology. He's not figuring out how to take it higher. He's just giving expression to a high Christology that's already there. So I'm very obviously sympathetic to the late Larry Hurtado and the other early high Christology people, David Capes and others. I think they're right on the money.
Okay, so with that, that's kind of the first piece of evidence then that Jesus regarded himself as divine. You give some others in that first paper. So in the paper, you move through these a little more quickly, so I think we'll be able to do that as well.
Sure.
So you talk about Jesus's self-identification as God's wisdom. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, that's another reason, because if you talk about yourself as the wisdom of God, in Judaism that's emerging at that time, and of course we always struggle with dates. How early is this Targumic tradition here, and how early is this rabbinic tradition there? But at least you still have that correlation, that coherence, where wisdom is understood as a hypostasis. And so in some circles, the wisdom of God is a way of saying God. And sometimes the hypostasis is functioning really as a circumlocution, like we mentioned earlier. So instead of saying God did this or God spoke, you say the wisdom of God did this. And by the way, as you know, memra, word, can function the same way. And so if Jesus is the wisdom of God, that is highly suggestive. And again, if I can cite Philo, you could say, well, oh, wait a minute, hold on, this must be a much later tradition. No, it isn't, because you have Philo, who's an older contemporary. And at the very beginning, I mean, before Jesus's public activity even gets underway, Philo was talking about the logos, the word, which would be the equivalent of davar or memra in Aramaic. The logos is the second God. And again, it's not to say this is identical to Christian teaching, but there's nothing in the prologue of John, for example, that's distinctly Christian, other than perhaps the mentioning John the Baptist by name. If you were to leave out the reference John the Baptist, you could take saying it became flesh, verse 14. Otherwise, everything that you have in the prologue of John could be on the lips of Philo. And so we need to guard against a later post-Christian, you might say, post-Christianity established by the 3rd or 4th century Judaism that's pushing back and becoming a very strict monotheistic understanding. But if you talk about Judaism as it understood itself and was willing to talk in the Qumran scrolls and Philo, other pseudepigraphal texts, including the similitudes of Enoch, 4th Ezra, then you can see that the idea of a hypostasis, a way of speaking of God, is present in another sense as his wisdom or as his word or as his spirit. You can see how then if Jesus is saying that's what I am, I'm God's wisdom, that's understandable in a Jewish context. You might shout and yell and say it's blasphemy, but it's still within the framework of at least Jewish discussions and speculations about the deity.
Off the top of your head, what's a passage where Jesus identifies himself as God's wisdom?
Well, Matthew 11. In fact, it's so distinctive, that passage, some call it a bolt out of the Johannine sky. But come unto me, all you who labor and are heavy laden. See, take my yoke upon you, learn from me. And you go to, I think it's Sirach chapter 50 or 51, off the top of my head. I'm not quite sure which chapter it is. And of course, you can find other places too, Sirach 24, and you can one or two other wisdom passages where that's how wisdom talks. Wisdom says, come to me. I mean, you have the summons come to me also in the book of Proverbs, so it's quite old, but come to me, take my yoke, learn from me, find rest for your souls. This is wisdom speaking. Well, now Jesus is speaking like wisdom.
Okay, so the third piece of evidence that you mentioned was Jesus's claims to divine sonship. So can you expand on that?
Well, that's very Johannine, a lot of it. So if you wanted explicit teaching, it's very, very Johannine. But like Father, like Son. And so sometimes it's implied. For example, in the 4th gospel, Jesus says, he does the works of him who sent me, or I do the works of my Father who sent me. There's chapter 5, chapter 9, maybe 10, maybe 3 different places in the Gospel of John. Everybody, oh man, this is distinctively Johannine Christology. Well, it turns out, no, it isn't. What we now have are Qumran texts, 4Q 521, for example, where the Messiah, his Messiah, whom heaven and earth will obey, that's an extraordinary statement, which is actually quoting pieces of Psalm 146, verses 6, 7, and 8, where it talks about Yahweh has made heaven and earth, all that is in them, blah, 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 blah. He'll give sight to the blind, he'll raise the dead, he'll do this and that, and so on. And that's in 4Q 521. Now, nobody's going to accuse the Qumran guys of being Hellenistic, polytheistic, crazy, or Christian. And they're talking about God's Messiah. When he comes, heaven and earth obeys him. Well, that is a very high Christology, and it's in a Qumran text that dates to 50 or so BC. And in it, and so the only way I can say is the author at this point, this particular part, it's one particular fragment of 4Q 521, the works of Yahweh are going to be done by the Messiah. The Messiah does the works of the one who sent him. And so what we have in John is an explicit expression of what is clearly presupposed and dramatized in 4Q 521. So is this distinctive to John? Not really. His wording may be a little bit, but again, it fits in with within the wider framework of Jewish messianism. So what I'm saying is Jewish messianism is a very exalted Christology. It doesn't mean all Jews held to an eschatology or all Jews even believed a Messiah would come. But within this range of discussion was a very exalted messiahship. And so what I think is going on, Dale Allison said this, let's hold a funeral for the idea that Jesus didn't have any exalted self-understanding. What's happened since then, 13 years or so ago and up to the present, is just continuing to confirm that as we continue to work our way through these recently published texts and reconsider a lot of things and get rid of a lot of bad baggage that I think bogs us down, unwarranted assumptions and so on. A lot of that, as I said, coming from the history of religion school.
Okay, let's keep going. Evidence, the piece of evidence number 4, Jesus' Passover request that the disciples eat meals in his memory. You say this tells us a lot about who he thought he was.
Yeah, I know. The language, it's unmistakable. It goes back to the Exodus memorial. It goes back to the book of Exodus. God has saved his people by delivering them the plagues that are brought against Pharaoh in Egypt. And then, of course, the Passover blood that saves their lives and destroys the Egyptian firstborn. And that's it. The people are out, on their way out. And they are to remember that. They are to eat the Passover, and they are to remember how God saved them. And there's Jesus saying, this do in remembrance of me. And of course, he's talking about blood, echoing the passage in Exodus 24:8, where Moses establishes with the blood of the covenant at Sinai. Of course, for Jesus, I think it's the new covenant, very much so, Jeremiah 31, and it's truly a new covenant, not like the old one, but the new one written on the heart. And so that is a very important thing. Who is this who's now asking, after talking about establishing a covenant in his blood, just as Moses did with the blood at Sinai, and wants his disciples, and he uses the same language, he wants them to remember him the same way Yahweh has commanded his people to remember his saving act in redeeming them from Egypt. So that's an extraordinary, I can't imagine, a prophet saying that. This is on a whole different level.
Okay, the 5th piece of evidence you discussed in that paper is Jesus' claim that he would sit at God's right hand. So this, I guess, goes back to that Son of Man text.
Yeah.
But also is this Psalm 110?
Yes.
Okay.
Psalm 110:1. Okay, let's talk about Psalm 110:1. And of course, that the chariot that Ezekiel describes in chapters 1, 10, and somewhere else has wheels. Daniel is talking about that too. If you go back to the beginning of Daniel, the vision that leads up to verse 9, he says he's looking, the night vision, he sees, and the thrones are set up, and the Ancient of Days sits in a throne that has wheels of fire. So it's the same thing. It's the Merkabah, it's the chariot throne. Well, God's the one who sits on that. Well, I think Psalm 110, and you can say, well, it's metaphorical, it's not to be taken literally. Oh, that may be true. You go back into the Davidic era, it's language, it's installation language for the king, and so on. Maybe so. But how was it understood in Jesus' time? Well, he takes it and combines it, Psalm 110, with Daniel. So the throne that's now he's sitting on is the chariot throne. He's sitting next to God on the most sacred, holiest spot, a square foot in the universe. And ask any mystical rabbi who's into Merkabah mysticism, and he's hoping against hope that God will grant him a fleeting glimpse of that chariot throne. Well, Jesus is saying to Caiaphas, next time you see me, I'm sitting on God's throne next to God, coming in judgment on you. And by the way, both passages, Psalm 110 and Daniel 7, are judgment passages. The enemies of God will be judged. So that is huge. to say he's seated at the right hand on that glorious throne. And of course, the Son of Man does that in the similitudes of Enoch. So you can't have an ordinary guy. Now, one more point though. And Jesus appeals to Psalm 110 in a very interesting place before he is brought before Caiaphas. And that's where he goes on the offensive, Mark 12 and the parallels in the other Gospels. In Mark 12, he says, why do the scribes call the Messiah the Son of David? He's not saying they're wrong, but he's just asking, why are they in the habit, if I may paraphrase, of referring to the Messiah as the Son of David? After all, he says, David, in the Holy Spirit, nobody would dispute that. That's right, speaking, guided by the Holy Spirit, speaking as a prophet. He says, my Lord says to my Lord. What? In other words, God speaks to my messianic descendant, whom I'm calling Lord. So then Jesus turns the table on his critics, and that is in a polemical setting, and says, if David calls his descendant his Lord, then how can these scribes call the Messiah the Son of David? And as you probably know, there's a cultural presupposition at work here. To be called son of somebody is to be somebody junior. The son is always a step below the father. He's saying in this particular case, David is looking at his descendant, however many generations away it is, and is calling him his Lord. And so he's foreseeing that his genetic descendant, who becomes the fulfillment of Psalm 110 and other prophecies, will in fact be his Lord. So the person who sits next to God is superior to David himself. And Jesus infers that from the text. And of course, it makes good sense. Whoever sits next to God literally, and not some kind of a installation address that's metaphorical, who literally sits next to God is superior to any other human. And that includes David or Moses or anyone else.
Okay, so those were the 5 lines of evidence that you gave in that earlier paper, which I think came out or sometime around 2000. But you've updated, you've given an updated essay that includes that Qumran text that you mentioned, 4Q521, and you also in that updated essay, the essay that I'm thinking of for viewers that are interested, it's called The Christology of Jesus, Another Look 30 Years Later. And the other text that you mentioned in that essay is 11Q Melchizedek. So I know you already touched on 4Q521. If you want to say more about it now in connection with 11Q Melchizedek, you can. But tell us about those 2 texts.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. 11Q13, of course, has been a challenge because the only substantial portion of that document that has survived is column 2, what we call column 2. Who knows how many other columns there might have been? It's the same problem with 4Q246. We have 2 columns in Aramaic, 9 lines each. How many columns on the left and the right of that particular little piece of leather we had? Who knows? But with 11Q13, we have some fragments of a previous column, what we call column 1. We have a few fragments of a succeeding column, which we call column 3. And we have about 16, maybe 17 pieces that we put together, and we call it column 2. Okay, let's just talk about this column 2 of what survives from 11Q13. It is extraordinary. It's absolutely extraordinary. And I'll reiterate the point I made a few minutes ago, about 4Q521. This is Qumran. These are not some crazies who entertain wild, speculative ideas. These guys are theologically conservative. They are vehemently anti-pagan, anti-polytheistic, anti-Greco-Roman. That's one of their criticisms of the ruling priests in Jerusalem, we think, which justifies the formation of this group that we should call the Essenes. I agree with Frank Cross, and that's the majority view this day. So we don't expect to have any kooky stuff in their library, not like a typical library today or even the books behind me. where you might have all kinds of things on the shelves that you don't agree with. Not the Qumran guys. They either wrote them themselves, or they're scripture, or they've collected books from other people that they find acceptable. And that's why sometimes it's hard for us to tell, did they write this themselves or did they bring it in? In 4Q 521, it's discussed. John Collins thinks, no, they got this from somebody else. They didn't write it. And I agree with him, but it's pretty close in vocabulary and concepts. Well, back to 11Q13. 11Q13 totally fits in with their eschatology. And column 2 begins with a quotation of Leviticus 25:13, which is a Jubilee passage. Now you go back to Leviticus, it's real obvious what the context is. It's just, after 49 years, it's a Jubilee year and debts are forgiven. And it's not eschatological. If it's looking to the future, it's only half century at a time, right? And then debts are forgiven. And it's for social justice, equity, fairness, letting people get a fresh start. It's like declaring bankruptcy, basically, and starting over. Well, this passage and other passages in Leviticus do take on eschatological meanings, almost like a typology. And this one does. And so there's a futuristic Jubilee. And it gets linked to Isaiah 61. And Isaiah 61, I think, that's what it's doing. It's taking the Jubilee idea of debt forgiveness and turning it into a future of sin forgiveness. And if you know Aramaic, you know choba can mean both, debt and sin. And you see that double meaning at work when Jesus chastises Simon the Pharisee in Luke 7, the sinful woman, weeping at Jesus's feet. And Simon is thinking, if this man knew, who this woman is, the fact that she's a sinner, he'd never allow her to touch even his feet. So again, it's presupposing certain things about holiness and so on, and clairvoyance that prophets are supposed to have. And Jesus turns to him and says, Simon, I have something to say to you. And he tells the parable of the creditor who has two debtors. Well, Simon is suckered into it. He thinks it's a parable about two debtors. It's not really. It's talking about two sinners, Simon and the woman. And both have been forgiven, which will love him more. It's beautiful. And it presupposes that double meaning of choba, sin or debt. So what happens is Leviticus, of course, was not talking about sin. It was talking about debt. You owe people money or, gifts in kind, whatever it is you owe. And there will be forgiveness for that. Well, that turns into a futurist view, an eschatological view of forgiveness of sin. And so Isaiah 61 and Leviticus 25:13 come together. Well, of course, Jesus uses Isaiah 61. He actually quotes 61:1 to most of verse 2 in his Nazareth synagogue sermon, right? Particularly the version in Luke 4. And so this text goes on to talk about it's Melchizedek who's going to do this. Oh, okay, Melchizedek, Genesis 14. Oh, Psalm 110, sit at my right hand, I'll make your enemies footstool for your feet, blah, blah, blah. You'll become a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. So the king who sits next to God has a priestly function. So there's a connection with Melchizedek there, right there in the Bible. And so back to 11Q Melchizedek, what does it say? It goes on to say that he will defeat Satan, Beliar. He will forgive the righteous people of Israel, forgive their sins. And it's just really, I thought God forgives sins. It also says he's the one talked about called Elohim in 2 or 3 Psalms. So he's up in heaven in the heavenly council giving direction and leadership. Like, who's Melchizedek? And if you still haven't quite got it, his name takes Yahweh's place, his name, in a quotation of Isaiah 61:2, which Jesus quotes. See, he's proclaiming the acceptable year of the Lord, Yahweh's acceptable year. And in 11Q13, it's Melchizedek's acceptable year. What? So Melchizedek's name has slipped. He's in a Yahweh text, just the way Paul does it in Philippians and elsewhere. That's who is this Melchizedek? And of course, the author of Hebrews in the New Testament says, well, he's a big deal. He's a type for Christ himself, because after all, Abraham, genetically speaking, the sons of Aaron are in his loins. He bows before Melchizedek and pays a tithe. So, of course, the argument is being made there on the part of this Christian writer in Hebrews is that Aaronic priesthood is subordinate to the Melchizedekian priesthood. And, I think that's the point of 11Q Melchizedek. So it doesn't turn out to be, this naturally some Christian wants to argue this. I think he's presupposing an exegetical tradition that's already there. So that's what I'm adding. Of course, this is a chapter that's in respect to, and this is part of the context I should mention, it's a Feshra for Ben Witherington. And my chapter is focused on the point that Ben made more than 30 years ago, the Christology of Jesus. And of course, I was one of the respondents. It was at the SBL meeting, I think, in 1990. And there are people, what are you talking about? It's back in the day, Jesus has no Christology. What are you talking about? Blah, blah, blah. And of course, one of his most severe critics, I won't mention his name, but he was a member of the Jesus Seminar back in the day and would defend the Jesus Seminar. And so I'm responding to that critique where this individual says this, that, and the other thing against Ben. And I say every one of his points has since been debunked. And so where are we 30 years later? Thanks to 4Q 521, a very exalted Christology. Thanks to 11Q 13. Thanks to 4Q 246, who this Redeemer is going to be called Son of God, Son of the Most High, and so on. Where are we today? A high Christology. And so in a way, I'm saluting Ben. His book, his book's a bit out of date now, but he was on the right path, making the right case back in 1990. And that's the whole point of that chapter. I'm updating myself a little bit. I'm updating Ben and showing that the Jesus Seminar in its quest for a low Christology, Jesus, the cynic, sage, the laconic sage who passes on Judeo-Christian fortune cookie advice, that's gone out the window. It's passé. It's obscure and looks strange today.
All right. Well, talking to you is really fun. I can tell you're just immersed in this stuff, and it's fun to just hear you, explore everything you've been reading. So before we wrap up, I didn't send this question to you in advance, and I want to give you a chance to sum up. But I went back recently and I watched a debate between Mike Licona and Dale Martin. And one of the things that Dale Martin said in that debate was that if there's anything he's sure that the historical Jesus said, it's that he said, "Why do you call me good? No one is good but God alone." And it seems like Dale's saying that's Jesus's way of saying, I'm not divine. So what do you make of a text like that? Here we've got, you've laid out several lines of evidence that Jesus has this very exalted view of himself. If that Son of Man figure is divine, what do you call a person that sits on God's throne if not divine? I'm not sure what the term is, but what do you make of that Mark? I think it's Mark 10.
You're right. It's Mark 10.
Yeah.
I think Dale, and I know Dale, he's a great chap. I know him and respect him. I think he's missing the point of the logic. And Jesus is not interested in getting into Christology at that moment, but he is challenging this person to think through. He's quick to pass out compliments. And on any occasion, again, go to John if you want, with a very explicit and high Christology. Jesus always defers to God the Father. And so there's nothing strange in Jesus' response, but to interpret that as denying his divinity or denying his oneness with the Father or something like that is to overinterpret the passage. and then so you have an obscure passage with an indirect reference of some sort, and that now overrides everything else. That's not how you do exegesis. And so you interpret this, which is it's a kind of a witty little riposte and reply to this person who's asking a question. And then that then becomes the hermeneutical key that will now, overthrow everything else. I don't think so.
All right. Well, we'll wrap up here then. What would you like to say to sum up this discussion?
I think let's talk history and theology just for a moment, very briefly. A historian looks at a text, and I would invite any historian to be a good historian and look at the text, and we could be talking about the traditions and histories relating to Muhammad, a Buddha, it doesn't matter, and leave the faith issue aside for a moment. Just look at the text. What do we conclude in looking at the Gospels, other related texts, and interpreting all of that in context? Well, Jesus is perceived by his contemporaries as a miracle worker. He's perceived as extraordinary, not like other miracle workers or would-be exorcists. No gimmicks, no smoke, no mirrors. He has an authority that's unmatched, and as they say, we've never seen anything like this. We look at his teaching and we say whether he knows what he's talking about or not, whether he's delusional or not, he clearly has a very high self-understanding. And so that's what the historian, and by the way, classicists historically have done that because they're historians. And they're okay. What did Julius Caesar think about himself, and what did other people say about him, and Alexander the Great, and so on and so on. And so you can be a historian. Now, a theologian will say, okay, that's neat. Okay, I see what you're saying. People thought Jesus performed miracles, and a segment of loyal followers sincerely believed he was resurrected. Many of them claim to have seen him post-Easter. And they conclude from that his teaching and the resurrection mean he is indeed divine. He is indeed at God's right-hand side. He does indeed intercede. Paul says, yeah, I didn't believe that at all. I was against it. Then wham, he appears to me. Now I believe it too. And so the historian looks at that. The theologian then asks, okay, are they just all mistaken? Are they all just liars? Well, the theologian might say, well, I do believe in God, so I'm open hermeneutically and epistemologically to the possibility that they're correct, that they actually are telling the truth. And that's the decision the human being makes. And so the historical material is there. Is it sufficient? Is it substantial? I think it is. And then you go from there and ask yourself personal and theological and philosophical questions, worldview questions. And if somebody might say, well, I'm very mystical, I had a vision. Well, that's good. That's for you, that might be just fine. And you ask yourself, does all of that stuff come together and make sense so that the confessional element that you find in the early church, in the New Testament and outside of it, does that square with the historical? Is it plausible? Is it reasonable? Is it something one can believe in? So I think those are two separate things, but they do connect and they do relate to one another.
All right. Well, I've had a really great time talking to you. Thank you for doing this.
You're very welcome.
Thank you all for watching, and check out my other interviews on the historical Jesus. I've done one with Dr. Ben Witherington, where he answers some of your questions. And I've also interviewed Dr. Dale Allison on the resurrection of Jesus, so you can go check out that interview as well. Thanks for watching, and keep exploring Christianity.